I'm Mike Farrington. Welcome back to my shop, aka the boardroom. The shop apprentice is closing in on his second birthday. Snowy springtime in Denver. So in this video, I'm going to be making two Japanese-styled lanterns, also known as Andons. And I get started by bifurcating this piece of hard maple. After some quick thicknessing at the wide belt sander, I head over to the table saw where I rip off a whole bunch of tiny little strips. And just as a quick note, I'm cutting these a little oversized, about a 32nd of an inch, and they will be sanded to exact thickness shortly. As I was making these cuts, I realized that the heel of my push block was a little worn out, so I decided to take the time to replace it. Usually I just run the push block over the jointer a few times to get a nice fresh surface, and then I glue a block of scrap wood on. So doing this makes cutting those little thin strips much safer and also much more controllable. And another thing I like to do is to use a zero clearance insert with a specially made splitter. So when I install that little splitter piece, I make sure that it's fat, and then I come back with a shoulder plane and I plane it down until it's just putting a little bit of pressure on the workpiece against the table saw fence. And this really helps with both cut quality and safety. I must admit, a wide belt sander makes this process a lot faster and a lot easier. But a hand plane and a jig works just as well. It's just a little bit slower. Always good to double check your work. A variance of about 0.03 of an inch creates a nice tight joint. So I'm not going to say much about this jig other than you'll get more information on it in the coming months. Alright, so now it's time to assemble the grid works. And at this point you have a bunch of strips with 30-degree angled, dados cut in them. And from here you need to cut them to length and assemble them into the grids. So fall's gone well up until this point. The grid work comes together pretty easily. And in my opinion, the grid work is the most important part of the project and also the hardest. And if you can get through this accurately, the rest of this project is easy. Next, I turn my attention to establishing the perimeter and also working on the infill pieces. So for this pattern, you really only need to know two angles, and that's 30 degrees and 60 degrees. And this happens to be my 60-degree jig. And these pieces will become the left and right perimeter of the grid work. As I'm doing this, I check fit often. If these pieces are made too long, it can end up distorting the grid. After making the pieces in the last shot, I realized this was going to take way too long. I looked around my shop and I saw the disc sander, and I often do miters on the disc sander, just not this small. And so I thought I'd give it a go. And to my surprise, it worked incredibly well. So these pieces establish the top and bottom perimeter, and also they turn the diamonds into right triangles. In my opinion, one of the best parts of using patterns in design is breaking the pattern, and I think it really creates a lot of interest. And as you can see here, I'm making sure that the pattern is not even, and you'll see how this all comes together a little bit later in the video. After I finish gluing in the perimeter pieces, I turn my attention to the rest of the infill. So the disc sander idea was working out so good, I decided to make a few new dedicated jigs. And to make all of the infill pieces, I use a 60-degree jig, which you see here, and also a 30-degree jig. When working on the infill pieces, I like to do all of one angle first. And I leave the pieces intentionally long, and once I feel I've made enough of them, I flip all the pieces around and I work on the angles on the other side. Here's a comparison between one piece cut on the disc sander and one piece cut with a hand plane and a jig. And the only noticeable difference is the little bit of fuzzy left over from the sander. As I mentioned earlier, the pieces are left intentionally long, and I do this so that they're easier to hold when they're loaded in the disc sander jigs. And now that all the angles on one side are done, I'm getting them a little closer to their final dimension. And then it's time to turn our attention back to the disc sander. This is the 30-degree jig, and it establishes both the 30-degree angle as well as the length of each piece. And this is done by setting up the stop block on the jig a little bit long and making small incremental adjustments until the pieces fit just right. Every so often I would have a piece that was a little too long, and I solved that with a couple passes from the hand plane. Each of these pieces was glued in with a little dot of glue from a toothpick. At this point, I was a little bored with the pattern, and I thought it would be a good idea to add some color. I think in some way I was motivated by the fact that spring was right around the corner. And I'll tell you what, making design changes halfway through a project is a really good way to make sure that they take twice as long as they should. Same deal here, set the angle on one side, adjust the stop block, flip the piece around, and set the angle on the other side. And if you're wondering, this wood is called sapelli, or I think it might be pronounced sapili. Next I needed to make a jig that would be used in conjunction with my router table. And if you haven't learned this trick yet, super glue with an accelerator makes jig construction incredibly fast. And of course, there's an added benefit of the fumes from the glue make you feel funny. And if you're wondering what the heck I'm doing here, all this will become clear in the next shot. I'm not sure what these are called, but I think they're used for sign making and other CNC type work. But this router bit comes to a 90-degree point. It may take a few test cuts, but the idea here is that I want that 90-degree point centered perfectly on the workpiece. And here was the end result, and I didn't like it. It looked a little too much like the Eye of Sauron to me. I think it was too stark of a contrast. So I was back to the drawing board and see what else I can come up with. I thought that if I added more color, it might soften the contrast between the maple and the sapili. I've been asked a few times how I plane the really small pieces, and the key here is you just don't pull the plane backwards over the piece and it'll stay in place. And here's the result for round 2, and I liked this much better. I don't know, maybe it's just the fumes from the glue, but this kind of to me resembled a flower, and I liked that. I think it went along well with my thoughts of springtime. So I added 2 new woods here. The innermost wood is cedar, and the outer wood is cherry. And to my eye, this seemed much more balanced. It seemed like it had just enough punch without being too obnoxious. And before, with just the sapili in there, it almost seemed like it was accidental. This feels a little bit more intentional. Though I may just be trying to convince myself that my design decision was the right one. With everything glued in place, it was time to clean up the outsides, and I decided I was going to fit these into a frame. Since I had my disc sander pulled out already, I was finding all sorts of uses for it. So this is my process for making frames, and this could be for a small Kumiko panel all the way up to a gigantic mirror. I do them the same way. And I start by establishing a miter on one end, and I use the actual workpiece to mark from, and this ensures a nice close fit. Next I rough cut with a handsaw, and I clean up with a hand plane. Last I glue everything up with the Collins miter clamps, and if you don't have these things, get a set, they're awesome. One trick I've learned over the years when gluing miters together is when you're applying glue, put glue on one side, then put glue on the other, then come back to the first side and put a little bit more glue on it. What you'll notice is that the glue is soaked in a little bit, and then a little bit more glue on the second side, and then clamp it up and you're ready to go. At this point, I was a little tired of Kumiko work, so I turned my attention to making the actual lanterns themselves. When making small, delicate pieces, as I am here, I think it's a really good idea to mill up your stock over a couple of days. And what I mean by that is don't bring your stock down to your final dimension in one foul swoop. Take off 1/8 of an inch, let it sit for a day, take off another 1/8 of an inch, and so on. Do that for a couple of days, and you'll find that your pieces will remain much flatter and more stable. At some point, I decided I didn't want to make two of the exact same lantern. I thought it might be fun to make one lantern with the right triangle pattern and the other lantern with the 90-degree pattern. And I figured while I was at it, why not use two different methods to cut the mortise and tenons? One thing does remain the same, and that is marking, and I like to measure and mark for my mortises no matter how I'm going to cut them in the same way. I start by marking in pencil where the two workpieces will connect. And then I like to come back with a marking knife and mark the actual location of the mortise. I find that marking in pencil first and then coming back and using the marking knife second kind of gives me an opportunity to make sure I'm not making any mistakes. It helps me visualize the joinery before I actually make any cuts. You might be asking yourself, why would I take the time to build the lanterns using two different methods for the mortises? And the answer is I just wanted to experiment, and I'll share my findings later in the video. I decided I would cut the first set of mortises with the JDS multi-router. And I also decided to make two cuts. I would mount the workpiece on one side, make a cut, then flip it over and make another cut. And this would ensure that the mortise is centered. So really all this tool is just an XY table with a router mounted 90 degrees to it. So in reality, you could just cut these mortises with a regular handheld router with an edge guide. And if we're counting seconds, I think a router with edge guide would be almost as fast. One of the downsides to using a router bit to cut mortises is you either have to round over the edges of the tenon, or you have to square off the inside edges of the mortise. Which is what I chose to do here, and it doesn't need to be super clean, just needs to be enough to make clearance for that tenon to come on in there. After the mortises were all cut, it was time to move on to the tenons. And here I'm just using a shop-made saddle, I guess you'd call it, that kind of fits over top of my router table. And this is a really simple shop-made fixture, but it is very effective. One of the pros to using a router to cut tenons like this is it gives an incredibly clean result. One of the downsides, though, is that routers just don't have a whole ton of power, so you have to kind of take a couple small bites. I think this issue could have been helped along a little bit with a better bit. I was using a pretty old, dull router bit for this. Here I'm just knocking off the inside corner of the tenons to make sure that there's no interference during assembly. Alright, shifting gears here. Let's move to the other set. So with these I'm going to use the hollow chisel mortiser. And I'm only going to drill each mortise one time. So I'm not going to drill and flip it around to make sure that the mortise is centered as I did with the other ones. Possibly more than any other machine in the shop, the hollow chisel mortiser requires proper setup. And I'm not going to go into that in this video, but if you have one of these and you've been frustrated with it, I suggest doing a little bit of research and learning how to properly tune the machine up, and I think you'll get some really good results. And I'm speaking from personal experience here. This thing sat in a corner parked for years until I took the time to set it up right, and now I absolutely love it. Even with a nice sharp bit, a little bit of cleanup is still required. Alright, here's another difference. I'm going to use the table saw as opposed to the router table to make the tenons. It's also important to note that this is going to require 3 blade height adjustments to make these tenons, and that's one for the front face, one for the back face, and then one for the top and bottom. And the reason for this is the mortises are not centered on each of the 4 legs. So after completing both sets of joinery using the 2 different methods, it's my opinion that the hollow chisel mortiser and the table saw are a better way to do 90-degree mortise and tenons. And my 2 main decision points are the fact that when you set the hollow chisel mortiser up and when you're operating it, you're looking at the mortise. That's nice. And then also, I guess I'm just more comfortable with the table saw than a router table. I've just used it so much more. So typically anything I could do on the table saw, that's going to be my first choice. Alright, and switching gears here, I'm running a very shallow rabbet, or some people call it a rebate, and this will house the Kumiko panels. And this is the type of operation where the router table really excels because of the start-stop nature of the cut. If you try to do this on the table saw, you would have a lot more cleanup work to do after you made the cuts. And here's what it looks like when we're all done. At this point, I had to choose the 4 pieces that would make up the top. So once these small pieces are glued in place, it will create a little shelf. And on that shelf, I'll put a frame that's covered in rice paper. I love using hand planes, and I wish I had the opportunity to use them more often. And cleaning up edges and faces of small parts like this is really where, in my opinion, a smoothing plane shines. So this is a number 4.5 smoothing plane, and it's made by Lie-Nielsen. And I think if I was to buy another plane, I would not get the 4.5, I would get a number 4. And the reason is the extra effort required due to the wider blade of the 4.5. It takes away from the kind of zen experience of planing, in my opinion. Quick tip, when you're planing narrow stock, drag your left palm on your bench top. This will help you feel when you're tilting the plane. And you know what? Sandpaper works great too, and I find that sticking an adhesive back piece of sandpaper to your workbench and kind of using your workbench as a giant sanding block works really well. During the glue up, one of my favorite old songs came on the radio, and the name of the song is Can't Get It Out of My Head, and it's by the band ELO, which stands for Electric Light Orchestra. And if you're a fan of 70s music, as I am, I suggest you jump on YouTube and do a search and give it a listen. So I'm a bit of an idiot here, and I'll admit it. I didn't realize when I was making these I made them about a 1/16 of an inch too thick. So after working up the courage, I decided to try and run them through the wide belt sander. I'm using that little push stick just to make sure that the pieces don't slip on the conveyor belt. So when I made these Kumiko panels, I made sure that they were a little bit bigger than needed. And the reason is I hand fit each one to a friction fit, so no additional fasteners are needed to hold these in place. So here I'm just gluing the Kumiko panel into this frame that I've created. And I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but I did put a small rabbet on the inside edge of that frame. And I think doing it this way makes it look really good. I think having that heavier border around the edge really makes the Kumiko panel look nice. Do you ever hear the Festool guys say that they use their domino on every project? Well, me too. Now onto a couple smaller details. This is one of the supports that I use to hold the light bulb in place. Eventually I'll drill a hole in this piece and it will carry the light bulb socket. This is a good example of what's good enough. I used to do this type of operation on my drill press, and I would take the time to set up a fence so it was real even and perfectly centered. And as I've gotten a little older, I realize, don't sweat some of the small details and just go ahead and countersink it with a hand drill. And speaking of countersinking, I think that's critical when you're using real small work pieces like this. They split very easily if you don't take the time to countersink. Now it's time to glue in that shelf I showed earlier, and as you can see, I've had to notch the corners of these pieces a little bit. Even with all that effort put into hand planing, the sandpaper still comes out. I find it to be the best tool to knock down the sharp corners. Alright, 2 for Tuesday. Let's get this second glue up done. Now it's time to make the frame for the top. I kicked around the idea of putting another Kumiko pattern on the top section, but for some reason leaving it plain just appealed to me. Design is always tough. It's difficult to know if you're on the right track or not. My thought process with leaving it plain was I didn't want to take away from any of the Kumiko work that's going to be on the sides of the lanterns. And back to the shooting board for some more fitting. And if you don't have a shooting board in your shop, I suggest you make one. They are incredibly useful. And you certainly don't need to have a special plane to use a shooting board. Way back in the day, when I had fewer tools, I actually made a small shooting board for a block plane, and it worked great. So now that the second lantern is glued up, I decided to turn my attention to the Kumiko panels for it. And this is just one more difference between the two lantern builds, and that is the first one I made the Kumiko panels first and then fit the lantern around it. This one I made the lantern first and I'm fitting the Kumiko panels to it. After the perimeter pieces have been made, I turn my attention to the internal gridwork pieces and I start by cutting them to length. After the pieces have been cut to length, I start cutting the lap joints. And if you visit my channel, you'll find another video where I go into a little bit better detail about how I do this. And with this particular layout, it's really important to be on your A game. I have some areas where I skip a cut and other areas where I need to do a cut centered between two cuts, as I'm doing here. And all this requires quite a bit of setup, and you really have to pay attention or it's easy to cut a piece wrong. And don't ask me how I know that. A few of the gridwork pieces needed to be cut to length relative to one of the lap joints, and here's how I took care of that issue. The gridwork only touches the outer frame in 2 places. So this is my method for making sure that I mark where that second cut needs to go. And I make a nice deep mark on both sides of the saw kerf, and this helps when setting up the table saw. You just take one of the teeth of the saw blade and make sure that it touches each of your 2 marked lines, and you get a pretty accurate cut. The final step for finishing off these lap joints is where the inner gridwork meets the frame. And since the frame is a little bit wider than the other pieces, it requires 2 passes on the table saw to make sure that the lap joints fit. With the lap joints completed, it's time to glue everything together. During the course of this build, I was kicking around the idea of naming these lanterns, and I have a few ideas rattling around in my head, but nothing concrete. And I'd just like to say at this point, I've never named a piece of furniture or a piece of woodworking that I've made before. And I would be interested to hear if you have any ideas of what I could name either one of these lanterns. So if you have any suggestions that you'd like to share, leave them in the comments section below. Or if you think it's a bad idea to name furniture or woodworking, let me know in the comments section below as well. I guess I'm sort of doing an informal poll here. I haven't made mention of this until now, but I just wanted to share that I'm building these 2 lanterns on spec. And spec is short for speculative, and basically what that means is I don't have a buyer. And my plan is to shop these around to a few different galleries in the area, and also possibly show these at some art shows this summer. And I think my attempt will go to one of the 2 different extremes. Either they're going to sell real quickly and easily, or I won't be able to get rid of these things and my wife and I will have new bedside lamps. And I say this because this is a very uncommon design style in my neck of the woods, and I've found that a lot of times people need to be able to relate to the design. They need to have something in common with the design, and I wonder if I'll be able to find that buyer in my area. But being a little bit more optimistic, I was once told by a famous furniture maker who was kind enough to take some time to talk with me when I was younger. He said, any piece of furniture or woodworking that you make needs to have mystery in it. And I will say I think Kumiko does have mystery. So I guess we'll just see which way it goes. The finish I'm using is called Osmo, and I apply 2 coats with a wipe-on, wipe-off type application. I get this lamp cord off of Amazon, and it's very much like traditional lamp cord, but it has fabric wrapped around it that looks really nice. And the molded-in switch works really well also. And I'll put a link in the description below. And these light sockets I just get from my local hardware store. And to attach the rice paper, I like to use double-sided tape. I think it's also called carpet tape. And I put the tape on all 4 of the outside edges, and then I also cut a few small squares, and I put them in the center of the Kumiko designs. And this method makes for a quick and easy install, and also if you needed to replace the paper in the future, it would be easy to do that as well. And with the rice paper attached, it's now time for the final assembly. About halfway through this build, I was starting to think that I'd made a pretty big mistake to try and make 2 of these at the same time in 2 different ways. But now, looking back, I'm happy that I made the decisions that I did, and I really did learn a great deal making 2 very similar projects in 2 different ways. Overall, I had a blast building these lanterns, and I was quite pleased with the end results. And it's been a lot of fun to share my journey with the YouTube community, and I really appreciate you following along. Till next time, thanks for watching.